The air tasted of ozone and old stone. Red lights pulsed across the cavern walls, casting the faces of the dead in a bloody, strobing glare. Dr. Aris Thorne stood his ground, knuckles white where he gripped the safety rail, the vibrations of the deep earth thrumming up through the soles of his boots. Before him, the granite face of the anomaly shimmered. It was less like rock and more like a heat haze rising from asphalt, a vertical plane of liquid reality that buckled and warped. Inside that impossible geology, the soldiers of the lost Ninth Legion stood frozen, their armor and flesh and bone fused into the crystalline matrix of the earth itself. They were caught mid-stride, a silent, eternal march into nothing. But they were no longer still. The figures inside the stone seemed to stretch, their forms elongating like reflections in a funhouse mirror. The rock around them groaned, a sound that was both a geological pressure release and something far more ancient, something organic. It was the sound of a seal breaking. The granite surface trembled as if it were the skin of a vast drum, and hairline fractures spidered out from the center of the wall. Dust rained down in thin veils, turning the emergency lights into shafts of red haze. "Containment is failing," Major Eva Rostova's voice crackled in his earpiece, sharp and devoid of panic. "Seismic reports ground-level instability across a 2-kilometer radius. Thorne, what is it doing?" Aris could not answer. He could only watch as the lead centurion, his face a mask of granite and quartz, seemed to ripple. The eagle standard he held, the Aquila, began to glow with a faint, internal silver light. The very substance of the rock face was thinning. It was becoming translucent. And through it, beyond the trapped legionaries, something else was moving. A shadow darker than the stone. A shape that did not belong to the world of men. The following narrative was a work of fiction, a speculative scenario built around one of Rome's enduring mysteries, the disappearance of Legio IX Hispana, the lost Ninth Legion. The Legion itself, and its vanishing from the historical record, were very real. In the 1st and early 2nd centuries, the Ninth Legion marched under Roman standards in Hispania and then in Britain. Inscriptions placed them in York, at the northern edge of the empire, guarding a restless frontier. Then, sometime after the year 108, the trail went cold. The Legion simply vanished from official lists and later records. Some historians argued that it was annihilated in a disastrous campaign against tribes in what is now Scotland. Others believed it was quietly transferred to the continent, perhaps to the Rhine frontier or the eastern provinces, and later destroyed there. No decisive battlefield, no clear order of disbandment, no final entry ever surfaced. For 2,000 years, the Ninth existed partly in stone and ink, and partly in rumor and speculation. It was as if an entire Roman legion had marched off the map and into a blank space in history. In this imagined timeline, that blank space was not an empty loss, but a deliberate move. And it had started, as such things often did, with a routine geological survey. 3 months earlier, a team from the University of Edinburgh had been mapping the deep substrata of the Caledonian Highlands, looking for neodymium deposits. Their deep-scan sonar had pinged something impossible, a massive sealed cavern 60 meters below the surface, with a metallic density that defied all geological models. It was not an ore vein. The returns were too structured, too regular. They had drilled. The first borehole camera they sent down had returned images that the survey chief initially dismissed as equipment malfunction. He saw shapes in the rock. Humanoid shapes. He saw the glint of metal where no metal should be. He ran a spectral analysis on the dust from the drill bit, and the results came back with traces of high-carbon steel and bronze, consistent with Roman-era metallurgy, fused at a molecular level with billion-year-old granite. By the time he finished reading the report, his hands were shaking. That was when Aris Thorne got the call. Aris was a pariah in the academic world, a brilliant geo-chronologist whose career had been quietly derailed by his insistence on investigating historical disappearances through the lens of geological anomalies. He had published a paper suggesting the builders of Göbekli Tepe had vanished not through migration or war, but due to a localized gravitational event. He was relegated to a cramped office with no funding and a reputation as a crank, a warning example for graduate students. But the man who found the cavern remembered that paper. He remembered the derision it had caused. And looking at an image of a Roman ghost trapped in solid rock, he decided a crank was exactly what he needed. The site was locked down before Aris even arrived. A quiet, efficient military presence materialized almost overnight, establishing a perimeter under the guise of an environmental survey for a new wind farm. Major Rostova met him at the temporary airlock installed at the entrance to the new access tunnel. She was a compact woman with pale eyes that missed nothing, the sort of person who moved like she always knew where the exits were. Her briefing was concise. A cavern, an anomaly, 5,381 distinct humanoid figures, give or take, embedded within the north face. All outfitted in armor and weaponry consistent with a standard Roman legion of the early 2nd century. "They are not fossils," she had said, her voice flat as she led him into the cavern for the first time. "There is no mineralization, no replacement of organic matter. It is substitution, as if every atom of flesh, leather, and steel was simultaneously swapped with granite, feldspar, and quartz. They were walking one moment, and a statue the next. The sight had stopped his breath. It was an army of stone, a Pompeii of the deep earth. The scale was breathtaking, the detail horrifying. He could see the grimace on a soldier's face, the worn leather of a sandal strap, the individual rings of a lorica hamata. They were marching out of the rock, or into it, frozen mid-stride. A silent, three-dimensional photograph of an event that should not have happened. His life's work, his ridiculed theories, stared back at him from the stone. "We need to know what this is, Doctor," Rostova had told him. "What it was, and if it can happen again." That had been 2 months ago. 2 months of frantic, secret work in the chilled, artificially lit cavern. Aris assembled a small, trusted team. Among them was Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a quantum physicist whose open-mindedness was matched only by his brilliance. While Aris focused on the historical and geological data, Kenji brought the instruments that would peer into the impossibility itself. They started with non-invasive scans, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, gravimetric sensors. The first strange reading came from the gravimeter. The rock face containing the legion was gravitationally inconsistent. It fluctuated, subtly but measurably, on a cycle of approximately 27 hours. It was as if the immense mass of the stone was rhythmically getting lighter, then heavier. Kenji had frowned at the data, muttering that it was impossible. Mass was supposed to be a constant. "Unless what we are measuring is not just mass," Aris had countered, "unless we are measuring its interaction with something else." That was when they deployed the quantum resonance scanner. It was a new, experimental piece of technology designed to detect echoes of quantum entanglement in macro-scale objects. The theory was that it could find the faint signatures of alternate states of matter, of objects existing in superposition. It was fringe science, perfect for a fringe investigation. Kenji calibrated the emitters, aiming a focused beam of entangled particles at the Centurion at the head of the stone column. He initiated the scan. The control room, a cramped container at the back of the cavern, fell silent. On the main screen, A topographical map of the rock face began to render. But it was not a map of solid rock. It was a waveform, a complex, shimmering pattern of interfering frequencies. "What am I looking at?" Rostova had asked, leaning over Kenji's shoulder, her expression tense. "That should not be possible," Kenji whispered, his eyes wide. He typed furiously, running diagnostics, but the results did not change. "The rock is not a solid in the way we understand it. It is a standing wave. A probability field collapsed into the shape of rock and a Roman legion. It is physically there, but its quantum state is fluid." "Put that in English, Doctor," Rostova demanded. Aris had stepped forward, his heart pounding. He understood. It was the core of his wildest theories. "It is not a thing that happened," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a thing that is happening. The Ninth Legion did not vanish into history. They walked into a place where time and space are not constants. This rock face is not a tomb. It is a window, and it has been closed for 2,000 years." As if on cue, a low hum had filled the cavern. It was not from their equipment. It came from the stone itself. On the screen, the waveform began to change. The amplitude spiked. The frequency shifted, climbing into the audible range. The scan, their gentle, non-invasive probe, had been the trigger. They had knocked on a door that had been sealed for millennia. That was when the first alarm had sounded. A klaxon blared from the seismic sensors embedded around the cavern. The ground trembled. A fine dust rained down from the ceiling. In the center of the rock face, the image of the centurion flickered. For the barest fraction of a second, the granite became translucent, and Aris saw the man's real face, bearded and terrified, his eyes wide with a 2,000-year-old horror. Then the rock snapped back to opacity. But it was different. It was thinner, less real. The humming intensified, and the lights in the cavern began to fail, plunging them into the pulsing red of the emergency strobes. They had triggered the next phase of the cycle, which brought them back to now. The cavern shook with a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a colossal heartbeat. The rock face had the consistency of thick, shimmering glass. The legionaries inside warped and twisted with every beat. Aris could see through them now, into a space beyond. It was a landscape of impossible geometry, of churning violet clouds and structures that grew and decayed in the space of a breath. Angles refused to behave. Distances folded in on themselves. It was a place not meant for human eyes. "The shear is widening," Kenji yelled over the noise, his hands flying across his keyboard. "The temporal differential is approaching zero. Whatever this cycle is, it is reaching its peak. The barrier between their space-time and ours is at its weakest point." "What happens when it hits zero?" Aris asked, though he already knew what Kenji was going to say. "It becomes a gateway," Kenji said, his face pale in the monitor's glow. "A stable, two-way gateway." "Seal the access tunnel," Rostova commanded into her comms unit. "Prime the demolition charges. We are collapsing this cavern, everything in it." "No," Aris shouted, turning from the rail. "You cannot do that. You do not know what that will do." "I know what it will do, Doctor," Rostova shot back, her gaze like ice. "It will put several 100,000 tons of rock between that thing and the surface. My orders are to contain this phenomenon. If understanding it is no longer an option, I will move to neutralize it." Two soldiers in full tactical gear moved to flank her, their weapons held at a low ready, eyes locked on the shifting wall. "You are thinking of this as a physical problem," Aris pleaded, walking towards her with his hands raised. "It is not. This is a problem of physics. Collapsing the cave might not seal the gateway. It might rupture it completely. You could turn this 2-kilometer instability into a 20-kilometer crater, or worse, you could sever the anchor and let that other place bleed into our reality unchecked." "You have a better idea?" she challenged, her hand resting on the sidearm holstered at her hip. Because you have approximately 90 seconds before my window to act closes." The ground bucked violently, throwing Aris against a bank of equipment. He caught himself and looked back at the wall. A shape was resolving in the chaos beyond the legionaries. It was huge, a silhouette of spindly, multi-jointed limbs, and a head that was a constellation of cold, blue lights. It was moving toward them, toward the thinning veil. The soldiers of the Ninth were no longer just stretching. They were being pulled apart. The granite that held them was dissolving, its matrix failing. The centurion's form disintegrated into a cloud of glowing dust, his eagle standard flaring brightly before vanishing. The legion was being consumed from both sides, and that was when Aris saw it. It was not a random event. The legionaries were not just trapped victims. Their formation was deliberate. They were not marching into the rock. They were facing out. Their shields were raised, their pila angled as if to throw. They were not being pulled in. They were a defensive line. They were not lost, Aris breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. They were sent. "What are you talking about?" Rostova demanded, her attention now split between Aris and the terrifying vista unfolding in the stone. "This was not an accident. It was a deployment," Aris said, his mind racing, connecting the dots. The specific location, a known weak point in the Earth's magnetic field. The timing of their disappearance, coinciding with a recorded period of intense solar flares. The unusual bronze alloy in their standards, rich in silver and trace amounts of tellurium, elements that react strongly to electromagnetic fields. "They were a sacrifice," Kenji murmured, catching on. "A temporal tripwire." "More than that," Aris said, grabbing a tablet and pulling up the resonance scan data. He overlaid it with a metallurgical analysis of the armor fragments from the drill. Their armor, their standards, their very formation, it is all designed to create a specific resonance frequency when exposed to the energy of a dimensional shear. They did not just stumble into this. They are the lock on the door. They are a focused energy buffer, a human circuit breaker designed to absorb the cycle and keep the gateway closed. "And our scan just overloaded the circuit," Kenji finished, his expression grim. A piercing shriek echoed from the stone, a sound that vibrated in their bones. One of the spindly limbs of the creature beyond pressed against the veil. The rock bulged inward, cracking like safety glass. The shimmering effect intensified as lines of stress crawled across the surface. 60 seconds, Rostova warned, her voice tight. She would not wait much longer. "Wait," Aris yelled. "If they are the lock, then we cannot just blow the door. We have to re-engage the tumblers. We have to reinforce the signal." "With what, Doctor?" "Positive thoughts?" "With this," Aris said, pointing to the quantum resonance scanner. "Kenji, can you reverse the polarity? Instead of scanning, can you broadcast a signal?" Kenji stared at his console, then at the massive emitters aimed at the wall. "Theoretically, it would be an unfiltered brute force emission. I could fry every system in this cavern, including us, and I would need a frequency to broadcast, a target." "I have it," Aris said, jabbing at a sharp peak on the spectral analysis display. "The unique resonance signature of the Legion's equipment. It is faint, but it is there, a harmonic ghost left behind in the stone. We do not absorb the energy, we amplify their signal. We give them the strength to finish their watch." Rostova stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sounds were the groaning of the rock and the hum of dying equipment. Protocol versus a madman's theory. Annihilation versus a chance. "Do it," she said at last, her voice a low command. "You have 30 seconds. After that, my men will detonate the charges with or without us in here." She turned to her soldiers. "Hold your positions. Protect the scientists." The two soldiers nodded, raising their rifles and aiming them not at Aris, but at the shimmering wall. It was a futile gesture on a physical level, but a profound one on every other. "Rerouting power now," Kenji shouted, his fingers a blur. "Diverting primary capacitors to the emitters. It is going to be everything we have." The main lights in the cavern died completely, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by the pulsing red strobes and the ghastly light from the failing barrier. The hum of the machine rose in pitch, becoming a deafening whine. Aris felt the hair on his arms stand up as the air crackled with static energy, the metallic taste of ions sharp on his tongue. "Frequency locked," Kenji reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "Aris, if this does not work—" "It will," Aris said, with a certainty he did not truly feel. He looked at the wall. The creature's limb was pushing through, a glistening, chitinous spike of black material that dripped a viscous fluid onto the cavern floor. The fluid hissed, eating into the rock like acid. The air filled with a smell of burnt sugar and chlorine, a scent that made his eyes water. "Now, Kenji, do it now." Kenji slammed his hand down on the main activation panel. A wave of pure, silent energy erupted from the emitters. There was no flash, no explosion, just an intense, physical pressure that forced the air from their lungs. Aris staggered, his vision swimming. The red emergency lights flickered and died. The entire cavern was plunged into absolute blackness. The shrieking from the wall stopped. The ground stopped shaking. For 3 eternal seconds, there was only silence and the sound of their own frantic breathing. Then a light began to grow from the stone face. It was a soft, golden light emanating from the legionaries themselves. The remaining figures, the thousands of soldiers still visible, began to glow. Their armor, their swords, their standards shone with a brilliant internal fire. The resonance frequency Aris had detected was now a visible, tangible thing. The energy from the emitters was being absorbed, channeled, and amplified by the very men it was meant to save. The Legion was lighting up. On the other side of the veil, the creature recoiled. The protruding limb dissolved into black smoke. The golden light of the Legion pushed back against the encroaching darkness, a shield of light against the void. They were no longer victims. They were warriors again, a spectral golden army holding the line against an unspeakable horror. The shimmering of the rock face began to slow. The violent warping subsided, the liquid quality of the stone hardening, becoming opaque once more. The gateway was not just closing, it was freezing over. The golden light from the soldiers intensified, burning away the last vestiges of the violet chaos beyond. Aris watched, mesmerized, as the last transparent section of the wall solidified. But just before it turned to solid granite, the golden light illuminated the other side one final time. He saw not one creature, but an army. Countless silhouettes stretched to a horizon he could not comprehend, a legion of nightmares waiting in the dark. They were not besieging a gate. They were waiting for it to open. Then the wall was stone again, solid, silent, unmoving. The golden glow from within the legionaries slowly faded, leaving them as they were before. A silent, stone army trapped in an eternal march. But something was different. The lead centurion, the first to dissolve, was back. His form was clearer now, sharper, and on his face the expression of terror was gone. In its place was a look of grim, unyielding resolve. The cavern's secondary power kicked in, and the main lights flickered back to life with a low buzz. The silence that followed was almost painful. Kenji slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. "It is stable," he managed to say. "The waveform has collapsed. It is just rock again. The gravimetric fluctuations are gone. Rostova lowered her sidearm, though she never took her eyes off the wall. She walked slowly towards it, her boots crunching on the fallen dust. She reached out a hand, hesitating just before she touched the surface. "What did we just do, Doctor?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Aris joined her, his legs unsteady. He looked at the silent soldiers, their duty done for now. He thought of the 2,000 years they had stood their watch, a silent, forgotten bulwark against an enemy humanity never knew it had. The 9th Legion, written off in textbooks as missing or destroyed, had been holding a line no one else even knew existed. "We did not lose the 9th Legion," he said, his voice filled with a new and terrible awe. "We just found the first line of defense." Rostova finally touched the stone, her fingers tracing the outline of a shield. "The cycle," she said. "It will happen again." Aris nodded. He looked from the stone soldiers to Rostova's face, then to the nervous expressions of her men. They were all soldiers now, in one way or another, conscripted into a war they had never known existed. His own fringe theories, his academic pursuits, seemed so small, so naive. He had been looking for answers in history, when all along he should have been looking for warnings. The 9th Legion was not a historical mystery to be solved. It was a post, waiting to be manned again when the next cycle began.